Okay, so picture this, you want to have a kid, right? But what if you could get a sneak peek at their potential, like even before they're born? We're diving into this whole world of IVF, but with a twist. Polygenic testing, is it like a dream come true or maybe opening a Pandora's box?
Interesting way to put it.
So IVF, that's already a thing, helping couples who have trouble conceiving, and Malaysia's become a bit of a hotspot for it, affordable, pretty open regulations. But now add this polygenic testing to the mix, PGTP if you want to get technical. We're looking at two articles by this Dr. Alexis Heng Boon Shin. He's at Peking University, and he really dives into this. Ethically speaking, it's a minefield.
Definitely complex.
We're not just talking about screening for diseases like Down syndrome, which is what's usually done. This is like potentially picking and choosing traits, intelligence, athleticism, maybe even physical stuff like how tall they'll be or their eye color. I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing, but like, how does it even work?
Well, it's actually pretty fascinating. Think of it like almost like a credit score, but instead of your finances, it's for potential human traits. It's called polygenic because they're not just looking at one single gene, it's analyzing hundreds, thousands even, to give a probability score. So not a crystal ball, but a glimpse into the likelihood of certain traits actually happening.
Okay, so that's the wow factor for sure, but you know what I'm thinking, right? What's the catch? There's got to be a catch.
Yeah, there's a catch. Imagine a world where only rich people can afford to basically design their kids, pick and choose those specific traits. Dr. Chin, he really lays it out there. We could end up with this generation of genetically enhanced haves and have-nots. I mean, talk about a social divide, right?
It's kind of terrifying when you put it like that. It's like some dystopian sci-fi movie where your place in society is basically written in your DNA.
Exactly. And what about the kids born with this technology? Imagine the pressure of knowing you were basically selected from a genetic lineup, expected to live up to all these predetermined expectations.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure. And is it even ethical, to be designing your kid like that? I mean, where do you even draw the line?
Big questions. Ethicists are wrestling with this, believe me. Dr. Chin, he talks about the potential harm, parents putting all these unrealistic expectations on their kids, and kids maybe feeling more like a product than, just being loved for who they are unconditionally.
Right. It's already tough being told you're a miracle baby after years of IVF, but crank that pressure up a notch because now you're supposed to be this genetically optimized miracle baby.
That's a really important point. Dr. Chin, he warns about this, the potential for harm to both the parents and the kids. Psychologically, socially, there's so much we don't fully understand yet.
And it's not just the emotional side, right? This tech could lead to couples who don't even have fertility problems choosing IVF just to get this selection process.
Absolutely. Dr. Chin really highlights that this could put more and more pressure on women, maybe going through multiple rounds of IVF, just for a slightly higher chance of having a kid with certain traits. And people need to remember, IVF is no walk in the park.
No, it's tough. Okay, so a lot to unpack there, even before we even get into the science of it all. But speaking of, one thing that really got me thinking was Dr. Chin's take on good versus bad genes, because it's not that simple, is it?
No, not at all. It's tempting to see it as black and white, right? But Dr. Chin, he argues that some genes that we think of as bad now, they might have actually helped people survive in the past. Or, get this, they might even be important for survival in the future as our environment changes.
Right. And he uses the example of the sickle cell anemia gene. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, it really challenges how we think about these things. One copy of the gene can actually protect against malaria, which is huge in some parts of the world. But if you have two copies, you get the disease. So is it good or bad?
It really makes you realize we can't just stick a label on a gene.
Right. It's all about context, how these genes work together and with the environment. And we're still learning so much about how genes work. We might think we're selecting for one specific trait, but there could be all sorts of consequences down the line, stuff we don't even realize.
It's like trying to predict the weather a year from now. Good luck with that, right?
Exactly. And that's why this whole thing needs a lot of caution. It's potentially powerful, but we better be darn sure we're using it responsibly.
So what I'm hearing is maybe pump the brakes a little bit before we go full speed ahead. Really think about the ethics of it all.
Absolutely. And those ethical concerns, they're tied up with some serious scientific limitations too, which we'll dive into more in the next part of our deep dive.
So we've talked about all these big ethical questions, but what about the science itself? Is it even accurate?
That's a great question. And Dr. Chin points out a major issue. A lot of the algorithms they're using right now for this polygenic testing, they're mostly based on data from people of European descent.
Wait, so if you're not, if you don't have European ancestry, this whole thing might not even work.
That's the big concern. Dr. Chin says for people of other ethnicities, the predictions could be way off. We need way more diverse data.
Okay, so not only is it ethically complicated, but the technology itself has some serious blind spots. Makes you wonder, are we even ready for this?
It's the million-dollar question, right? Dr. Chin argues that if we rush into this without fixing those biases, without making sure it works for everyone, it could have some really bad consequences.
So let's just say, for argument's sake, that we do fix those problems. We get the data, we get it right for everybody. Are we good then? Are there other scientific hurdles?
Well, even then, there's still a big challenge, which is actually understanding how genes work. We're talking about hundreds, thousands of genes all interacting with each other and with the environment. It's incredibly complex.
So, even if you think you're selecting for one trait, you could be messing with others without realizing it.
Exactly. Unintended consequences. And those consequences could be passed down, making things even more complicated. Dr. Chin is really emphasizing caution here. We don't have all the answers.
Right. It's not like we can just hit the undo button.
Exactly. And that brings us back to ethics and regulations. Dr. Chin argues that Malaysia, being a hub for medical tourism, they need to be super careful with this stuff.
Because if they allow it, you could see people coming from all over the place wanting to, design their babies, even if it's not even a sure thing.
It's a real possibility. Dr. Chin points out the economic side of things. This could be huge for medical tourism. But he also says, look, Malaysia needs to be ready for the ethical and social challenges that come with it. It's a package deal.
So it's a tough call. How do you weigh the potential benefits against the risks for individuals, for society?
Exactly. And Dr. Chin, he says this isn't just a decision for a few people to make. He wants a bigger conversation with scientists, policymakers, ethicists, and this is key, the public.
This feels big, like with great power comes great responsibility, kind of big.
Absolutely. Dr. Chin is very clear. He says this technology could change humanity as we know it. Proceed with caution, ask the tough questions, and talk about it before it's too late.
Because once that genie's out of the bottle,
there's no putting it back in. It really makes you think about the future and who gets to decide what it looks like.
It's a lot to process. But isn't that what makes these deep dives so interesting?
For sure. Sometimes asking the right questions is more important than having all the answers, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And speaking of, there's one big question we haven't really tackled yet. Should Malaysia actually allow this for medical tourism?
It's tough. Dr. Chin lays out both sides, the potential benefits, but also the ethical concerns. He doesn't really say yes or no, but he does have a clear message for the Malaysian government.
Okay, and what's that?
He wants them to really think this through, to do their homework, investigate the ethical side, set clear rules and regulations, and only then decide whether or not to allow polygenic testing for medical tourism.
So no rushing into it.
Exactly. He's saying, look, this has the potential to change everything, so let's be thoughtful about it.
So we're looking at this really powerful technology, but also all these ethical questions,
right.
Societal questions. It's a big moment.
Huge. And Dr. Chin, he's really pushing for a global conversation. This isn't just about Malaysia. Every country needs to be thinking about this, especially as this technology gets, easier to get.
Right, like a global ethics committee or something.
Yeah.
Right, because if one country says yes, it's going to have ripple effects everywhere.
Absolutely. And that raises a huge question. How do you make sure access to this kind of technology is ethical and, fair when it has this much power?
Yeah, and how do you even start that conversation? When there are so many different values, different beliefs, different cultures involved, it feels almost impossible.
It's definitely not easy. But Dr. Chin would say that's even more of a reason to start talking. Like, now, we have to figure out how to talk about this, even when we disagree.
Find that common ground.
Yeah, and maybe even more importantly, set some boundaries. He makes a really good point. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should.
Just because you have a hammer.
Doesn't mean everything's a nail. Exactly. No. And in this case, we need to be super careful about what we're, hammering at. Dr. Chin's advocating for being really careful, putting things like human dignity first, social justice, thinking about the future generations.
That's a lot. Honestly, I feel like we just scratched the surface here. But it's clear this technology, it could be amazing, but it could also be, kind of terrifying.
Totally agree. It makes you realize how important the ethical side is. Science doesn't exist in a bubble, right? It connects with our values, our choices. It's about what kind of future we want.
And the crazy thing is, those choices, they'll echo for generations. It's a heavy thought to end on, but I think it's important. So here's something to think about. What kind of future do you want? And how should technology fit into that picture? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.